Welcome to all of our guests today. Thank you so much for joining this conversation. This is, I guess, the second webinar we've done related to our research. For those of you who are new to us, Energy for a Secure Future is an initiative focused on helping Canada to build a resilient energy future for our international allies through energy trade, but most importantly, for people here in Canada at the community level. And this paper is a result of a lot of important conversations and research over the last while. We were very grateful to Heather Exner-Perot for her work. It's called The Other Energy Security, Addressing Energy Poverty in Canada's Indigenous Communities. And it's important because this is an aspect of the domestic energy security conversation we don't often hear about. Now, before we get into the discussion of the paper, and we have a lot of experts with us here today who I'll introduce in a moment, I'd like to start by introducing and having a few words from Enserva's CEO, Gurpreet Lal. Enserva was a really critical partner to us in getting this work done. And so a big thank you to Enserva and a thank you to Gurpreet, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Shannon. And we have been extremely proud that we got to be a part of this. And we are really impressed with the outcome so far. So thank you to you and your team for bringing this to light and letting us be a part of it. You know, I think when we look at our membership and who we represent and why this is important, it's important to us because our members are really trying to raise awareness of the importance of this issue that we're facing with vulnerable communities. We're investing in critical infrastructure, and that just cannot wait any longer, and we need to push for that further. I think Canada has an abundance of affordable natural gas, and Indigenous people urgently deserve equal access to affordable energy in the Canadian society. And we're all committed to equal opportunity for all. And I think this paper actually highlights the need and the solution moving forward. So thank you so much for you and your team for bringing this forward and all the hard work that's gone into here.
All right, thank you so much, Gurpreet. And so without further ado, I'll introduce our panel for today. So we're really happy to be joined by Chief Christine Longjohn, who is the Chief of Sturgeon Lake First Nation in Saskatchewan. Guy Lonechild, who is the CEO of the First Nations Power Authority, as well as Heather Exner-Perot, who is the Director of Resource Policy at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. She has a much longer title, but that is the title in the nutshell. She's one of Canada's leading experts in resource development. And what we hope to do in this hour-long conversation is talk about the realities on the ground in communities, and what each of these kind of leaders from their different vantage points has seen. And to get us started, I think the best person to hear from is Chief Christine. So Chief Christine, you and some of your fellow chiefs from Saskatchewan have done a lot of work to raise this issue of energy security for First Nations, and specifically, you've been seeking support for access to natural gas. Can you tell our audience, why are you doing this, and what is the situation for your nation and others when it comes to energy security?
Good morning. First of all, I want to acknowledge the chiefs that we've been working along with, Chief Ananas from Beardies and Open Mesas, Chief Tavita from Muscopeta, and Chief Fox from Pie Pot, as well as yourself, Shannon, Guy Lonechild from First Nations Power Authority, Scott Langing from Upfront Consulting. So we've been doing a lot of networking as well over the last while here. But for Sturgeon Lake, the natural gas project has been on the Indigenous Service Canada 5-year capital plan for several years. We've made it clear that this project is a priority for our nation. We have had several discussions with ISK and with the ministers who had previously funded First Nations gasification projects within Saskatchewan. And our nation is surrounded by customers of Sask Energy. It's all around our nation. So presently, our homes are heated by electric heat. They're heated by propane, and we still have some houses that are heated by wood. The delivery for the propane is transferred from Melfort, which is an hour and a half away from our nation. The cost of heating is putting our families at financial hardships as well, because it can cost them anywhere from $1,300 to fill a tank. And in Saskatchewan, we have extremely cold weather. We just went through a cold spell here, where our temperatures are -49. So when our temperatures are dropping, our tanks are gelling up. And in the event that the home runs out of propane, the family is put on a safety risk. And so they're using heaters, which increases their energy, their power bill. And that also includes the capital costs of water heaters that burst, replacing sewer and water lines, the heat source that does not last, which it'll require another delivery waiting, and we could wait from 2 to 5 business days for a delivery. Um, we have families that are on low income as well, and they should never have to choose between putting food on their table or paying the propane to heat their homes. So we want the same comfort that many of our homes have across not only our province but across our nation. We're looking at cost savings. We're looking at community health and safety, consistent, predictable a heat source, and the capital asset longevity as well. So that's kind of the issues that Sturgeon Lake First Nation and our other partner nations that have been dealing with on a daily, yearly basis. So that's kind of my opening.
Thank you so much. I realized I was on mute. Thank you for setting the scene. I think that's really good context. And I want to kind of go up, I guess, from one community to multiple communities. Guy Lonchal, you've been working with a number of communities in Saskatchewan and possibly in other provinces. Certainly, I've heard about this issue for First Nations communities in BC and in Ontario. You've been doing energy audits with communities. You've been learning a lot about what's going on. In the report, you talk about energy as the new water. Why do you say this? What have you learned as you've worked with communities on energy security?
Well, thanks very much to all of the chiefs and all of the advocacy that has been going on around energy poverty in Canada. And so the First Nations Power Authority, the 165 and greater First Nations and Indigenous communities, industry members that we represent right across the country now, are very aware of the challenges that First Nations families face. Kitchen table issues are being discussed right now in terms of the challenge of putting food on the table versus paying the electricity bill. And in places like Saskatchewan, where we do suffer from very cold winters and, of course, increasing costs for food and energy, many First Nations that are on the call today and that we've been advocating for in the past little while here, the 20 First Nations do suffer from energy poverty. And what I say that this energy poverty is the new water. It's a commodity that's required to keep people warm. Over 60% of the total energy use for households on First Nations is used for home heating. And if you're relying upon SAS power and electricity to heat your home, you're talking about $800 to $1,000 per month for already an overcrowded and substandard home that doesn't have energy efficiency measures in place. We work with over 81 First Nations in the province of Ontario. The province of Ontario, through the Independent Electricity System Operator, helps to deploy community energy managers in each of the First Nations that we work with in that province. And so we're on the third year of an initiative. We'd love to see the province of Saskatchewan and the province of Manitoba come up with some policy measures to provide relief for First Nations who are suffering with energy poverty, and provide a bit of a roadmap for what does energy efficiency and rooftop solar look like, and a variety of mix of energy options for First Nations who don't have natural gas service. But ultimately, why we're here today is to implore upon the federal government that we do need the installation of natural gas and access to natural gas so that we can have safe and reliable service to these communities who rely upon propane and rely upon, again, expensive power and having to pay their power bills as opposed to paying their food bill, which is really unfortunate.
Thank you, Guy. Heather, you've written a great paper on this issue. What were some of the key takeaways for you when you look at this from a national standpoint?
Yeah, great question, and thanks for inviting me to do the deep dive on this. I am from Saskatchewan, so I know a lot about Guy's and Christine Chief Long John's issues too. Met Guy about 20 years ago when I was about 5 years old, so a little bit older than that. But how I became interested, a lot of my research in the past has been on rural and remote communities, and in particular in the Arctic, and really about diesel-dependent communities. And that people don't appreciate, first of all, this is an incredibly expensive way to access energy, but it also has a huge dampening effect on economic development. And so when we talk kind of an underdeveloped Arctic, where we don't have maybe as much industrial activity, mines, that kind of thing that maybe we were looking for right now in the Arctic, a lot of it is because of very high energy costs, and it just becomes a very uncompetitive region even for that kind of investment. And I think in the last 10 years, a lot of the focus on getting off diesel has been to switch to solar. And that seems almost, chaotic is to, focus on solar in the Arctic, where for a fact that for the coldest months of the year, there will be no solar power. And I don't mean to diminish lots of, great initiatives to enhance, community energy access with solar. But to put your eggs in that basket, as I think policies has directed us to do in the last 10 years, we've been approaching, trying to get to the perfect instead of the good. And the good in many cases is access to natural gas. The Arctic's a little bit different, and diesel-dependent communities are a little bit different. But coming closer to home, particularly in the provinces, that is a great option that we've just been leaving on the table. Now, why did it start to get more urgent is, after COVID, energy prices started to rise. And some of it was, the natural gas prices following the invasion of Ukraine. But that was pretty short-lived. And people should appreciate that gas price, the natural gas price right now is actually very low. And so that's not what is contributing to your high energy costs. But a lot of it is, it is in electricity, it is in natural gas, it's in the build-out. Sometimes it's in the carbon taxes. Sometimes it's the supply chain that's been disruptive. But that has created, I think, another layer of urgency that, first of all, maybe more Canadians are experiencing energy poverty, energy insecurity, so more people are aware of it. But as Guy and Chief Long John will say, like most First Nations have been experiencing, never not have energy insecurity. And we're just kind of, realizing what the impacts of that are right now. And I'll just, finish off that there's, I think, quite a difference between remote and Indigenous communities and how they experience energy poverty, and how a household, kind of, on the brink, hard time having their pills in the South does. And that is, in a lot of cases, communities themselves pay the cost of energy for the First Nation or for the community and Inuit communities. And when I was looking at the energy poverty data, it said that Nunavut had the lowest energy poverty rate in Canada. And I thought, how can this be true? This makes no sense. How they calculated is based on household expenditures. And so in most First Nations and Inuit communities, households are not paying for the bill. The community is paying for the bill because households could not ever afford that energy bill. But now that energy costs are so high, it's the communities that are really feeling the pressure, and therefore all of the services that the community receives are under threat. And so, and this came up in some of the interviews, some of these, anecdotes that, you might not think about in Calgary, Saskatoon, not being able to pay for the energy costs for the hockey rink, and not being able to pay for the energy costs for the youth center. That these are, having to pay the energy costs is trickling down across a whole bunch of other services. So I was grateful for this chance to think about, shouldn't we have some more options on the table? Shouldn't this be a higher priority to fix this problem of energy poverty, that's become very widespread in Canada?
Thanks, Heather. And I think that's a great kind of springboard to my next question. Chief Christine, Heather's describing the role that the nation itself plays when households can't afford their energy bills. And now that we're getting to a place where that's hard for the nation. Can you talk about that dynamic and how the nation steps in, and then what the challenges end up being for the nation?
Well, right now, a lot of our homeowners, they have to pay their own propane unless they're on a social service program, which covers the cost. But when we're talking about programs that are covering those costs, I believe it's 30% of the budget is going towards the cost of the propane. And when we're talking about natural gas, those cuts could be up to 70% on those budgets. We have a lot of huge buildings as well. When we're talking about the school, we were just having a meeting the other day, and during that cold spell, and those propane tanks are a lot bigger than our homes. And so those tanks only last 2 weeks, and then they have to refill them. So imagine the capital operating management costs that all of our capital buildings are taking, and that money could be used in different areas in improving the overall community. But right now, a lot of our budget is going into keeping the heat on within our buildings. And so it's been a struggle for a lot of our families who are low income as well. We don't have a lot of jobs out here, and so with limited employment within our nation, we have a lot of a lot of our families that don't have the resources to be able to financially manage their heat or their groceries, and trying to juggle both of those at the same time. It's been very difficult. And so, we do our best within our nation to make sure that our families are well looked after. And during cold spells, when we have, issues with delivery services. We did have a delivery service. This is going back during COVID, when a lot of deliveries there was a lot of sickness, and we had delivery drivers that had gotten sick. And so at that time, there was no deliveries to our nation, and we had homes without propane at that time. And so that's where all of the breakdowns within the mechanics of the home begin, right? And so that is an added cost to our nation to do all of those repairs. So it's not only the food on the table, but it's all of the extra costs that go along with the repairs that happen should a home or a community building go without that heat source. So we were looking at a $250,000 payment that we had to own source, right? Because of all of the mechanical breakdowns that happened during no heat source within those homes. So that's a crisis within our nations. It's not only our nation, but if there's other nations that are dealing with exactly the same issues that we are dealing with when we're talking with the other chiefs. They also tell the same story that Sturgeon Lake tells, and that it is time for our nations to be able to live in comfort. And I'm going to say that again because, um, we don't have that heat source that is a reliable heat source that is there when we need it. We have to conserve our heat, to make sure that it's lasting us, through the winter. So those are some of my comments.
Thank you. And yeah, I think, we don't often think about the fact that, gas pipelines go into homes and they're just always running. And if you have to refill a propane tank, and then if there's COVID, there's a lot of vulnerability. It can work a lot of the time, but then if it doesn't work, it's a real challenge. Guy, I think it was one of your staff who in some of the research they were doing was telling me about some of these broader economic impacts as well, where, if people on the nation can't afford their energy, and they might say no to employment opportunities or other things. And so, Heather's comment around the drag on the economy and the drag on people being able to elevate themselves is a big one. Are there any other things, we haven't talked about that are kind of hidden effects of this energy problem?
I can't.
Guy, you're still muted. Sorry.
Sorry about that. Okay. So thanks very much for the question. Absolutely. This is exacerbated by the fact that the prairies are home to some of the fastest populations in terms of the demographic picture. In Saskatchewan, for example, First Nations and Métis people make up approximately 18% of the total provincial population. We're the fastest growing segment in all of Canada in terms of the Indigenous population. And so when we have a real challenge in terms of ensuring that we are competitive as we need to be in the economy, we need to equip young families and young Indigenous people with the tools to be able to thrive. And so I've always used the analogy that we are on a 100-meter dash race with the rest of society. We're starting from 60 meters behind when it comes to some of the socioeconomic conditions that we endure. And some of those are income inequality. And so if there is a job to go to and you're going to make $16 per hour or $17 per hour, but your power bill costs $600 or $700 per month, really what is the logic in actually participating in the economy if you're actually going to put yourself further and further behind and you have 3 or 4 or even 6 kids to feed? And so that really is the stark reality that many people in many northern communities and rural and remote communities are faced with. There's, again, substance abuse issues, there's family violence, there's a whole host of challenges that chiefs on this call deal with on a daily basis. It's the hardest job in this country when you have to be able to manage and try to grow for the future. And so I've been in those shoes before. I was elected a leader 15 to 20 years ago. The income inequality and the wealth between the rich and the poor is actually getting further and further apart. And so really that's the outlook we have in terms of our own Indigenous economies. We have to change that. And so from a policy perspective, the paper goes through some of the initiatives in terms of investing in infrastructure in Canada, the clean electricity, rural and remote communities initiatives, the off-diesel initiatives. What we're calling for here today is a new Investing in Canada infrastructure program for Indigenous communities. One that is not bilateral between the province and the federal government, because often our priorities aren't looked at. And so we would like to see, coming from this and future conversations with key decision makers in Ottawa is investing in natural gas infrastructure where it makes sense. In places like southern Saskatchewan, where there's a wide distribution of natural gas service to non-Indigenous communities, we need to see this in Indigenous communities now.
Thank you, Guy. Chief Christine, did you want to jump in? You raised your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that something that we haven't talked about is the dampness in the homes with propane. Natural gas is a drier heat source, and so we in our nation we did the University of Saskatchewan did a mold and research and found that over 52% of our homes had some visible mold within their homes, and that is something that we haven't talked about is the mold within the homes because of the dampness, because of the source of heat. I just wanted to add that in.
Thanks for adding that. That's another of these health risks that you don't think about, but that get associated with different types of energy. I guess, shifting gears a bit here, Heather, what are some of the policy barriers that have been standing in the way of solving this problem? Well, like, what have you seen from your vantage point?
Yeah, and it was very interesting to dig into it. But there used to be greater policy around energy access, that it was, that there was a policy prerogative to do so. Guy told me about, programs in the 80s and 90s in Saskatchewan, for example, where natural gas access was first, extended to many communities. Some signed on, some didn't. The ones that signed on, have reaped tremendous benefits from having done so in terms of better accessibility to energy. But everywhere, that it used to be a priority. And certainly in the last 20 years, and we list all kind of the different programs that we've seen, certainly in the last 20 years and definitely in the last 10 years, where that has been replaced from access to electricity transmission or natural gas grids to focusing on a sustainability lens, where really the priority is to reduce emissions from communities. And of course, there's no one that is against reducing emissions, but there have been some unintended consequences of that policy direction, where again, where affordability and reliability are not as important as reducing emissions, and so you get some complications there. And then some policies that I think privilege again, the perfect over the good, where solar and where you could move off more diesel if you went to propane or if you went to compressed or liquefied natural gas, but that the policies only favor a switch. The only thing you can switch to is a renewable energy. And the example of that is that the carbon tax has been exempted from heating fuel, which is often, what communities use for the heating side, not the electricity side, but it's not been exempted for natural gas or propane. So again, all these, which would reduce emissions, and in some cases actually be cheaper. Diesel is a pretty expensive, heating oil is pretty expensive. And so where we do have good options, but not all the options have been left on the table. So, and I think we might get into this now later, but I just, there have been, Ontario has had a great success in its natural gas access program. And there has been tremendous demand where dozens of communities, I think more than 100 applied, dozens have been given the access. And what they did, and this is starting in 2018, was to charge $1 a month to natural gas customers so that they could fund the expansion to these dozens of communities that didn't have it. And I feel like that's a very palatable way for ratepayers. Our bills are pretty high, to have $1 a month where it's actually going to, extend to communities that don't have it. Many of them are First Nations, and also allows for that economic development, so that the GDP of the province or the GDP of the community also grows. I think there are some really good ideas out there, but we have taken a very narrow lens on what our policy objectives are. They've focused only on moving to renewables, not even reducing emissions, moving to renewables. And that is where I think we need to look back and say, what are we really trying to accomplish? What is the balance of priorities? Look at what communities are facing, and let's target, the very urgent needs that we're facing today.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. It's a small price to pay for every other non-Indigenous community to have natural gas service in the treaty territories that we both enjoy. and give that back to First Nations where they will have natural gas service. Couldn't agree more.
And I just have to
Mhm.
say, because in the first paper I did for you, Shannon, where I hadn't realized this, which you wouldn't, most of us wouldn't realize, it's blind to us, that there are First Nations literally beside, or the reserve is literally beside another community. And the municipality has natural gas access and the First Nation doesn't. And that's because the municipality is under the provincial authority, you know, the utility. You need the feds involved to get that access to the First Nation. The jurisdiction hampers it up. And literally neighbors, in BC, we're talking about 25 meters away that one will have natural gas access and one won't.
It's wild. Now, Guy, you and some of the leaders you've been working with, some of the chiefs you've been working with, had entered into kind of a collaboration with the natural gas provider in Saskatchewan, which is Sask Energy. Can you talk about the work you've done in trying to bring a solution to this and trying to extend access? What else needs to happen as you kind of go down this road?
Yeah, we are keenly interested in becoming strategic partners with Sask Energy. I've developed quite a good relationship with the CEO, Mark Yeh, and really listened to a lot of the priorities of the First Nations that we're working with here. The memorandum of understanding with Sask Energy was specifically to look at some energy efficiency measures, what programs and services Sask Energy may or may not provide to Indigenous and non-Indigenous Saskatchewan. The looking at installation of renewable energy technologies that would help provide more energy security and sustainability measures in the short term. But in the longer term, we need to start taking a look at actually the expansion of strategic investments in First Nations communities that are adjacent to. And so Sask Energy for a good number of years now has been looking at doing cost estimations in partnership with First Nations. We think that there's some opportunities to collaborate both with Sask Power and Sask Energy. They both have the monopolies in the province to provide energy services to First Nations communities, but we need a bit of a bridging opportunity in the interim, looking at innovative, as Heather says, innovative financing mechanisms to be able to provide this services, whether that's through power purchase agreements with Sask Power in the interim to entertain new renewable energy projects and help to finance this energy infrastructure we require for natural gas installation to these communities. And so we are now formalizing advocacy efforts with the Assembly of First Nations. The AFN has joined in the cause in terms of passing a resolution that would start taking a look at how we could advocate in lieu of the province not being able to advocate to the federal government or the Sask Energy having some constraints. This is where FNPA comes in to help advocate and build a bridge between the federal investments and provincial collaboration. So we think that the MOU will help to achieve that.
All right. Well, that sounds very promising. I want to dig into more because, there's the issue of maybe certain government programs, federal, provincial, whatever, but certainly federal,
Yeah.
it's been the case that they favor switching to certain technologies. But
Right.
there's been a mention of this jurisdictional gap. Can
Right.
you, I guess, open it up and Chief Christine, please feel free to jump in. As you've gone and explored this, what is this jurisdictional issue? Why does the federal government need to be involved? Can you explain to folks what's going on there?
Maybe I'll go first. I'll just say that the paper discusses the two-way conversation between the federal government and the provincial government, and especially in regards to the Environment and Climate Change Canada has a Futures Electricity Fund. And that Futures Electricity Fund is usually a conversation that the federal government and the provincial government and provincial crowns have. We think that that should be opened up so that they can deal directly with First Nations leaders, such as Chief Christine, to say, okay, what are your requirements for home heating? What are your requirements for natural gas infrastructure investment? And how can we make this happen? So this paper is a call to Environment and Climate Change Canada, Natural Resources Canada to collaborate and make key investments so that First Nations don't have to rely on solely SAS power to heat their homes. And so that's the crux of why we think there's a jurisdictional problem here. It's a conversation without having the leaders in the room to negotiate their energy future.
Thank you. Chief Christine, any other practical recommendations you think, or practical steps you think governments need to take to try and advance and solve this issue?
Sturgeon Lake and other nations have had the gasification heat sources on our capital plan, 5-year capital plan for several years. And when we are asked to classify what our priorities are for those the capital projects, we always put gasification at the top. And it seems to be falling on deaf ears. We know as a nation what our needs are, and so we prioritize that. And I feel that other nations are doing the same. We understand that there are limited funds available as well for all of capital projects within Saskatchewan, and so it doesn't meet the federal government's priority list. And over time, it's costing the government more dollars at the end of the day. And if they were to switch, they would be saving. And at the end of the day, it would be the province of Saskatchewan that benefits. We benefit through the heat source, but they benefit from the economic growth. So.
I can jump in here too,
Please.
Shannon. Now it's a political scientist explaining how utilities work. So for those of you that work in utilities, it may be painful. For those of you that don't, it may be dumbed down enough that you can finally understand it. But the way that utilities work is when you want to extend a service, it is everything is regulated. These are all monopolies. You aren't building parallel pipelines or parallel transmission lines because it's too expensive. And so the government allows these utilities to have a monopoly. But in return, the government sets the rate and makes the decisions of when and how they can increase the rate or when and how they can extend their service, so that they can't just do it and charge everybody, but that the regulator agrees it's a good idea. To get the access to a lot of these more rural or more remote communities, that is very expensive. And so usually, there is a formula that the regulator uses to say when you can extend a line or not. And usually these communities that don't already have a service, the reason is because the formula doesn't allow for it to happen, that they wouldn't be able to pay whatever, the cost would be to extend that service over the timeline that the regulator says it must be paid. And so they're just left on their own, kind of to their own devices. And often, I think typically it would be a 40-year. You would expect if you could pay that capital cost over 40 years, then you could fit in the regulator's kind of formula. For some remote or rural communities, it's not much more than that they could pay 80 or 90% of the cost, but there's still a delta, the 10 or 20% that just isn't covered. And often governments in the past, provincial and federal governments, have been willing to pay that small delta, not least because in a lot of cases, they're paying for the extra cost of the energy. If they have to ship in propane or if they have to ship in heating oil, that right. The government is subsidizing that on their end anyways. And so it's just, why wouldn't you just subsidize the extension of the natural gas pipeline? Now, what's happened is that a lot of regulators and the federal government are looking at getting off fossil fuels by 2050. Right. And I think they don't want to pay for something where you're going to need 40 years to pay for, paying off a fossil fuel access. And so where it's a take it or leave it, stay where you are. And if you can at some point switch to renewables, whether it's hydro or solar or wind, but in the meantime, just stay where you are. Again, it's the communities that pay this in action, because they are paying more for high costs now. They're usually on higher emitting sources than they would be if they could switch to natural gas. And the government is still paying for that subsidy for that high energy cost. So it's more expensive. It's still more emissions, and the communities suffer along. So there is, again, I'll say it again, this preference for the perfect over the good, and just not being willing, to kind of compromise on the sustainability goals.
Yep. You know, one of the names that I thought could work for this paper is "We Can't Wait Anymore." Because that whole message of don't worry, wait until we can just have you on electricity, cheap electricity, as opposed to the high cost of electricity you pay now for heating. It's it's not even something that can be guaranteed. Guy, do you have any comments on that? Like, what are your thoughts?
Absolutely. There's recent examples of where there was a penciling exercise of the federal government to say just that. So the Waitakiniya Power Project in Northern Ontario that connected over 20 First Nations that were diesel reliant with transmission line development did a penciling exercise on what would the price of diesel cost over the next 20 to 30 years. And they subtracted that cost, and the cost was astronomical. And so it just made perfect sense to empower Indigenous communities like the FNPA and our member organizations, our member owner First Nations, is to own energy infrastructure. And so if there's new models where they can develop their own utilities, micro utilities, or they can develop their own natural gas installation, there are prime examples around the country. And so we think that this makes sense. I think what Heather's talking about is exactly that, is we need to find innovative ways where we're going to actually be able to be not just reduce our costs for service delivery, but also be better for the environment as well. And so natural gas is far better for the environment than propane or other heating sources that many of these communities rely upon. So it just makes sense.
Natural gas costs.
Absolutely. Um, so I want to now kind of move over to the moving forward section of questions. Heather, you talked a little bit about the experience on Ontario and some of the experience in BC. Are there any policy recommendations you haven't spoken to yet that you think are important for people to hear about?
Yeah, I think, an obvious one is to make all heating fuels exempt from the carbon tax. And again, this is, kind of a perverse or unintended consequence that by exempting heating oil, kind of a derivative of diesel from the carbon tax, then it becomes cheaper. Even if propane or natural gas was cheaper to begin with, now it's not. And so you're actually incentivizing people to stay with that most emitting, most carbon intensive fuel. And also depending on geography, for some people, propane or natural gas may be easier to access. And so again, it was really kind of seemed geographically motivated that particular fuel was exempt. And then again, it is, to be a bit more broad-minded in the kinds of energy sources that remote and Indigenous communities should be able to access. And I'm sure, Chief Longton would agree, let them choose what kind of energy sources they should be able to access. And of course, that they're going to have environmental and sustainable goals in mind when those communities do choose the type of energy they want. But they will probably have a more balanced look at all of the factors that affect their community and make their decisions based on that. So if the community is saying natural gas is the best option for us, allow them to make that choice. Allow your programs to fit those preferences in. And so when we talked about a lot of the programs currently only will support clean energy or renewable energy to expand those to allow the community to decide. And then finally, to support utilities. And at some point that becomes at the provincial level, not the federal level, support utilities in provinces to help cover that delta. And this isn't new. This isn't a handout to First Nations. This is something that has been done historically. There would be no farmer with, electricity or natural gas if there weren't programs like this in the past. And to allow, people to, have the entire rate base help the entire, help extend that rate base. And again, there may be a cost to the ratepayer, but there are macroeconomic benefits to expanding that energy access to everybody. And again, I'll say, the taxpayer is going to pay for subsidies for expensive energy in remote and Indigenous communities regardless. So why not reduce that cost, reduce emissions, enhance choice? The only reason we're not is because we have such a narrow lens on what our policy objectives are.
Chief Christine or Guy, do you have you want to add to that?
Sure.
Anything we haven't recommended
I'll,
yet?
I'll just say this is that talk is cheap. If we are going to really commit to environmental and economic reconciliation with Indigenous communities and First Nations in Saskatchewan, it just makes sense that we need to prioritize areas of the population that are very, very vulnerable to sliding backwards. And we need to look at Indigenous people as assets and communities and nations that are on a daily basis struggling with some of these things. It's important for us to move the marker. And so we're keenly interested in working side by side in partnership with Sask Energy and Sask Power. It's the reason why First Nations Power Authority exists, not just on a national policy advocacy front, but also building Indigenous capacity in the communities. And so if we can, again, see innovative ways where the ratepayers can shoulder some of this redistribution of opportunities for investment for the gasification of First Nations, we're all for it. And also just building for the future. And so we think that this is an important step forward. Today is a very important first step in the steps of many until we get what we need to see in terms of these key investments.
Absolutely. Chief Christine, I want to give you a kind of an opportunity to respond to all of this, but I wanted to let people in the audience know that we can take a little bit of Q&A here as we get towards the end of our planned session. There's a kind of a Q&A button, and you can enter your questions there, and I'd be happy to ask the panelists before we wrap up. So, Chief Christine, we've heard a lot of ideas around new models for financing, exempt these fuels from the carbon tax, let communities choose. What are your thoughts?
I agree that we need to let communities choose their heat source. At the same time, we always have to remember where we are today and where we've come from. And when I'm talking about that, I'm thinking about our treaties and the treaty promises that were made back for us in 1876. At that time, when we've had all of the newcomers and all of the visitors to the land come, our elders tell us that the agreement was made to share the land with peace. And at that time, the stories that I've been told is that the land was to be shared to a depth of a plow. And so what does that mean? That means, they show us their hand. And so that's how deep that they were supposed to be. The land was supposed to be shared on. And when we think of all of the resources throughout Canada that has been shared nationwide with all of our, all of the Canadians, at the end of the day, we deserve that same comfort that each of the homes have, and to always remember that we existed here for we just recently have carbon dated 11,000 years ago. And so we've always been here. We've always agreed to share the land as well. And so I just want to bring that up again, because that is an important piece when we're talking about resource sharing, energy, and all of that. It's important to always remember where we come from and where we're going, and to continue to work together in partnerships as well, for the betterment of all, whether it be First Nations, whether it be Canadians.
Thank you, Chief Christine. That's a really important point.
I can add to this too. I just
Okay.
want to say something here is that in the province of Saskatchewan, we've been contemplating the replacement of coal-fired generation with nuclear development and small modular reactor technology. And then just recently, we've heard the Minister Jeremy Harrison talk about the refurbishment of coal plants. Well, that isn't necessarily going to reduce the emissions profile of heavy emitters in Saskatchewan like SaskPower. And so there is a duty to consult with First Nations in the province. And any kind of energy transition or refurbishment of coal-fired generation does need the free, prior informed consent of First Nations in the province. And so it just makes sense for us to rely on natural gas service rather than more coal-fired electricity generation to heat our homes, because that's not going to help the environment. It isn't going to help, of course, the cause of First Nations who are faced with energy poverty challenges without natural gas service. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you, Guy. We have one question from the audience. So it says, as Canadians are now becoming more aware of the important strategic role of energy, they are understanding better how important energy export infrastructure is. Is there kind of a discussion to have around having funding discussions, not only for Indigenous ownership, but for using and distributing the economic returns from some of these projects to expand access to energy? Any thoughts on that from any of the panelists, Heather?
I can start. And yeah, you know what, that I think it was a year and a half ago, wrote the first paper for EFN, which was on, or ESF, which was on equity ownership in a lot of these natural gas projects that we're moving forward. And this one focused more on internal domestic use and distribution. But there was an economic, at the bottom of the paper, you can see a little case study of Ochise Energy. And Ochise is in Alberta. I believe it's Treaty 6, but it is the biggest producing natural gas producer of any First Nation in Canada. And if you didn't know, there are, a couple dozen of First Nations that have or historically have produced oil and natural gas on reserve. Ochise's business is quite good now. They have a very good deposit, and they're producing a lot of natural gas through their 100% community-owned company, Ochise Energy. We actually opened up an office in downtown Calgary about a year ago. So Ochise produces all this natural gas, then they sell it to the local gas plant, and then, which they also have an ownership, a smaller ownership stake in, and then that gas plant brings back some of their own natural gas to their community. So they're actually producing the natural gas that they're using, and they are getting economic benefits from. So it's not just an export opportunity, I guess is what I want to say, but communities are providing natural gas for that local use, that local distribution, and benefiting it from it both ways.
That's a great example. Chief Christine, Guy, do you want to weigh in on that? Okay, I have one more question. So this question is, has this work been shared with NRCan and INAC, and are they willing to find the best solutions that are fuel agnostic? So we have shared this research with the Government of Canada. We haven't had specific conversations yet with NRCan and INAC, in part because every government in the country is completely seized by tariffs and talking to Washington. But we definitely intend to continue to advance this and to work with, Chief Christine and Heather and Guy and some of the other chiefs as we do this. If once Parliament comes back, we hope to engage the budget process on these questions. We really need to kind of break down the barriers, and so there's more steps to this work that we haven't taken yet. Any other questions from the audience or comments from our panelists?
I think we're definitely in early stages of talking with Indigenous Services Canada. We've had RDG Rob Harvey at one of our meetings, and of course ADMs from Ottawa, and the work will continue where we will be requesting a meeting with those who will meet with us, major decision makers, on coming up with some alternatives. And then we're hoping that both CEOs of SaskPower and Sask Energy will convene a meeting with the chiefs sometime in the very near future here with the leadership.
So I have one more question here. Is there a role for First Nations think private energy companies have to play in solving these issues? I don't know about private energy companies. Heather talked about monopolies. Is this
there are private entities in the province that are brokers of natural gas contracts with First Nations. Connect Energy for one, but there are a number of them across the prairies that do provide those types of services. Are there alternative financing mechanisms? Absolutely. Where there's a will, there's a way to help to consolidate some of these initiatives so that maybe First Nations become their own natural gas distributors. The model is there, like in Alberta, there are gas cooperatives that provide services. The Onion Lake Cree Nation does that. And so maybe there's an expansion of a conversation about how these communities who are suffering with energy insecurity actually become a cooperative on a province-wide basis. So those are the types of things I think we need to really think about and helping to provide wealth generation opportunities for them as well over the long term. So developing,
Yeah.
building, owning, operating, maintaining their own assets would be a very viable way for the federal government and the province to help realign those spending priorities where there's overspending in social assistance and realigning those for economic purposes. I think there's ways forward for that.
And I'll just add, Saskatchewan, is dominated by Crowns, by SaskPower and Sask Energy, but across the country, there's, different service providers. Some of them are private companies. So you think of FortisBC or Enbridge or ATCO and many others. But we do detail one case study in the paper on Big Stone Cree Nation. And that was a great partnership, from the interview that we had between ATCO and Big Stone, where ATCO and the community worked very closely together. Again, it was not a huge moneymaker for ATCO to go out and build a relationship and make the case to the province. And together they, got a grant from the province to extend the natural gas pipeline to Big Stone Cree Nation. But it was the right thing to do. It was a partner that they wanted to have, in the community, in the region that they operate with. So, often great things happen when industry actors and Indigenous communities work together. Together, they have a very powerful advocacy and lobbying voice. And in the case of Big Stone, it resulted in access for the community.
All right. Well, we've come up to time. So I want to just take this opportunity again to thank Inserva and Gurpreet Lal and everyone in Inserva for their support of this work. I want to thank Chief Christine Longjohn for stepping away from the busiest job in the country to be on this webinar, and Guy Lonechild and Heather Exner-Perot for your expertise today. I think, this conversation, as Guy said, is the beginning of a lot of work and the extension of 20 years of work when you hear from Chief. So let's talk more about this, and then let's start to act on solutions. So thanks everyone for your time today, and thank you.